How much would you sacrifice for your child, only to have them betray you for $500,000? That's the question that keeps me up at night, staring at the walls of a house that no longer feels like home. My name is Linda Carter, and at 57, I thought I'd known every shade of heartbreak. I was mistaken. Let me take you back to a day that was meant to be pure joy, my son Steve's 30th birthday party. It was the moment I discovered the boy I'd given up my career for had traded my devotion for a check with 6 figures.
Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you on an emotional journey you won't soon forget.
I grew up in a small town in Kentucky where dreams were as fleeting as fireflies at dusk. My parents were school teachers, and I was the first in our family to attend college. By 26, I was making waves at a public relations firm in Chicago, pitching campaigns for major companies, and saving enough to buy a cozy condo with a view of Lake Michigan. I thrived on the energy, the late-night strategy sessions, the thrill of a signed contract, the crisp sound of my heels on the office floor. But when Steve was born, everything changed. His father, my husband Mark, died in a factory accident when I was 6 months pregnant. There was no insurance, no savings, just me, a baby on the way, and a mountain of debt. So I made a choice. I left my job, sold my condo, and moved to a modest house in the suburbs of Indianapolis to give Steve a stable life. I took on freelance projects, worked late after he slept, and poured every bit of myself into being the mother he deserved. I didn't just want him to survive. I wanted him to soar. Steve was my entire world. He had Mark's hazel eyes and a laugh that could melt any worry. From the time he was little, he dreamed of being a musician, a rock star, he'd declare. He'd strum a toy guitar in the living room, singing songs about dinosaurs and race cars. I'd applaud like he was performing at Madison Square Garden. By high school, he was composing real songs, and I saw a spark in him. So I paid for piano lessons, drove him to gigs in gritty bars, and even remortgaged the house to buy him a professional-grade guitar when he was 18. When he got accepted to a music program in Nashville, I cashed out my retirement savings to cover his tuition. Every penny felt like a step toward his dream. Or so I thought. The day of Steve's 30th birthday was supposed to be a celebration of everything we'd built together. I'd spent weeks planning the party at our house, a warm 2-story home with a big backyard, the same one I'd kept spotless for years. I rented tables, hung string lights, and cooked all his favorites, pulled pork macaroni and cheese, and my famous cherry cobbler. I even splurged on a custom cake shaped like a guitar with Happy 30th Steve written in green icing. The guest list was small but special. Steve's bandmates, a few old friends from school, and his fiancée Sarah, who I'd welcomed like a daughter. I wore my best dress, a burgundy one I'd saved for special occasions, and pinned my hair up the way Steve always said he liked. As I set out the plates, I could almost hear Mark's voice. "You've done well, Linda." The backyard smelled of barbecue and summer blooms, and the Indiana sunset painted the sky in hues of pink and gold. I stood by the grill, sipping lemonade, watching Steve laugh with his friends. He looked so much like his father, tall, with a charming smile that made you trust him instantly. Sarah was beside him, her dark hair catching the light as she leaned into him. My heart swelled with pride. This was my family, my legacy. I'd given up promotions, vacations, and my own dreams, but seeing Steve happy made it all worthwhile. I had a surprise for him too, a gift I'd been saving for years. Upstairs, locked in a safe, was a check for $50,000 money I'd scraped together from freelance work and careful budgeting. I planned to give it to him that night to help him and Sarah start their life together. Maybe a down payment on a house or new equipment for his band. I couldn't wait to see his face. As the evening wore on, I noticed Steve and Sarah whispering by the dessert table. They kept glancing at me, their faces tense like they were debating something serious. I brushed it off. Maybe they were nervous about a toast or planning a surprise of their own. But when Steve called everyone to gather for a speech, my stomach twisted. He held up his beer bottle, the string lights glinting off the glass, and cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice steady. "This is a big day for me, and there's something I need to say." I smiled, expecting a nod to me, maybe a mention of all we'd been through. Instead, he looked right past me, his eyes cold. "Sarah and I are moving to LA. We got a deal, a big one. $500,000 to sign with a label, and we're selling the house to fund it." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Selling the house. This house. The one I'd paid for, maintained, loved. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a joke. But Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Linda, we've already got a buyer. It's a done deal." My knees buckled. The backyard spun, the lights blurring into streaks. I tried to speak, but no words came. Steve wouldn't meet my eyes. The guests shifted awkwardly, their murmurs filling the silence. And then I saw it, the contract tucked under Sarah's arm with my address printed in bold. They weren't just taking my home, they were erasing me. The backyard fell silent, save for the faint hum of crickets and the clink of a glass someone set down too hard. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the picnic table, the rough wood biting into my palms. Steve's words echoed in my head. "We're selling the house. My house. The one I'd poured my life into, the one I'd made a sanctuary for him." I looked at my son, searching for the boy who used to hug me and call me mama. But his face was a stranger's, hard, unyielding, focused on Sarah's hand on his arm. Sarah, with her sharp eyes and that contract clutched like a trophy, didn't flinch. "Linda," she said again, her voice like a blade, "you'll need to move out by next month." I felt the air leave my lungs. Move out to where I was 57 with no savings left after funding Steve's dreams, no job beyond the freelance gigs that barely covered the utilities. This house was my anchor, the only thing I had left of the life I'd built after Mark died. I'd painted every wall, planted the rose bushes by the porch, hung the curtains that still swayed in the kitchen window. And now, my own son was ripping it away for a $500,000 deal without so much as a glance in my direction. The guests stared at their plates, avoiding my eyes. One of Steve's bandmates coughed, and a woman I vaguely recognized from his high school days slipped away toward her car. I was alone in a crowd, my heart splintering with every second of silence. "Steve?" I finally managed my voice barely above a whisper. "This is my home. You can't just—" He cut me off, still not meeting my gaze. "Mom, it's not personal. The label needs collateral, and the house is the only way. You'll be fine. You always figure things out." His words were casual, like he was talking about selling an old car, not dismantling my life. Sarah nodded, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll help you find a place, Linda. Maybe an apartment closer to town." An apartment. I'd raised Steve in this house, cooked him pancakes on Sunday mornings, stayed up late sewing his Halloween costumes. And now I was being offered a one-bedroom rental like some tenant they pitied. I don't remember how I got through the rest of the party. I moved like a ghost clearing plates, forcing a smile when someone mumbled their goodbyes. The string lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to mock me. Steve and Sarah stayed by the dessert table, laughing with his bandmates as if nothing had happened. I wanted to scream, to grab him by the shoulders and ask what I'd done to deserve this. Instead, I carried the leftover cobbler inside the kitchen's familiar creak under my feet, feeling like a betrayal of its own. I set the dish on the counter and sank into a chair, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the glass of water I poured. The check for $50,000 still locked in the safe upstairs felt like a cruel joke. I'd saved it for him, for them, and now they were taking everything. That night, after the last guest left and the house was dark, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the photo of Steve and me on his graduation day. He was 18, grinning in his cap and gown, his arm around my shoulders. I'd been so proud, even as I wrote the check for his Nashville tuition, knowing it meant I'd never retire. How had that boy become the man who'd just thrown me away? I replayed every sacrifice, every late night, working every dream I'd buried, every dollar I'd spent on his music. I'd thought love was enough. I'd thought he was enough. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Sarah's voice in the kitchen. She and Steve were at the table, papers spread out like a war map. I stood in the doorway, unnoticed, my bathrobe pulled tight against the early chill. Sarah was talking fast, her pen tapping the contract. The buyer's offering $450,000, but we can push for more. Once it's sold, we'll have enough to cover the label's advance and set up in LA. Steve nodded, sipping coffee from the mug I'd bought him for Christmas, the one with a guitar etched on it. "What about Mom?" he asked, his voice low, almost reluctant. Sarah shrugged. "She'll manage. She's tough. Besides, we can't afford to keep her here." My stomach lurched. Keep me here, like I was a pet they couldn't afford to feed. I stepped into the room and they froze. "What's this about a buyer?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Steve looked down, but Sarah met my eyes unflinching. "Linda, we told you last night. The house is being sold. The realtor's coming tomorrow to appraise it." I stared at her, then at Steve, waiting for him to say something, anything to prove he wasn't part of this. He didn't. Instead, he pushed a piece of paper toward me, a real estate listing with my address, my home, reduced to square footage, and a price tag. "It's for the best, Mom," he said, his voice flat. "You don't need all this space." I wanted to tear the paper apart to tell them they had no right. But the weight of their decision pressed down on me heavy as the Indiana humidity. I took the listing and walked upstairs, my legs moving on autopilot. In my bedroom, I opened the safe not for the check, but for something else, a folder I hadn't touched in years. It held the deed to the house, still in my name alone. Mark and I had bought it before Steve was born, and I'd never added anyone else to the title. A small spark flickered in my chest. They thought they could sell it without my consent. They were wrong. That afternoon, I drove to the library, the only place I could think clearly. The smell of old books and polished wood calmed my nerves as I sat at a computer searching for answers. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to look up property laws in Indiana. What I found made my heart race. Without my signature, no sale could go through. Steve and Sarah were counting on me to roll over to sign away my home like I'd signed away my savings for his music. But why were they so confident? That's when I remembered something odd, a bank statement I'd seen in Steve's room a few weeks ago, tucked under a stack of music sheets. It wasn't his account or mine. It was in Sarah's name, with a balance far higher than a part-time barista should have. I drove home, my mind racing. While Steve and Sarah were out meeting the realtor, I slipped into his room. The air smelled of his cologne, a scent that used to comfort me. I found the statement under a pile of notebooks along with a letter from a bank. My hands shook as I read it. Sarah had opened a joint account with Steve, and they'd been funneling money from an unknown source, thousands of dollars labeled as consulting fees. But the real shock was a handwritten note clipped to the letter in Sarah's neat script. "Once the house sells, we transfer the $450,000 to the label's escrow. Don't tell Linda until it's done." My breath caught. They weren't just selling my home. They were hiding something bigger, something they didn't want me to know. I sat on Steve's bed, the statement crumpled in my hand. The boy who'd once cried when I burned my hand cooking his birthday dinner was now plotting behind my back. Sarah, who I'd treated like family, was orchestrating it all. I felt like I'd been gutted, my love for them carved out and discarded. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't the fragile widow they thought I was. I'd built this life from nothing once before, and I could do it again. I folded the statement and tucked it into my pocket. They wanted to play this game? Fine. But they'd underestimated me. The days after Steve's birthday party blurred into a haze of disbelief and quiet rage. I moved through the house like a guest in my own life, washing dishes, folding laundry, and smiling tightly when Sarah breezed through with her clipboard of real estate notes. Every creak of the floorboards, every glint of sunlight on the rose bushes I'd planted felt like a reminder of what I was losing. I wanted to confront Steve, to demand answers, but his avoidance was a wall I couldn't breach. He'd leave early for band practice, come home late, and when he was around, he'd bury himself in his phone, muttering about the deal. Sarah, on the other hand, was everywhere, measuring rooms, snapping photos for the realtor, acting like she already owned the place. I felt invisible, a shadow in my own home. At first, I tried to make peace. Maybe if I showed them I was still useful, still needed, they'd reconsider. I cooked dinners, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, the kind of meals Steve used to love, hoping he'd sit down and talk. He didn't. He'd grab a plate, mumble thanks, and eat in his room with Sarah. I offered to help with their move to LA, suggesting I could pack boxes or research apartments. Sarah's response was a curt, "We've got it handled, Linda." I even brought up the $50,000 check, thinking it might soften them. "I've got something saved for you," I said one evening, catching Steve in the hallway. He barely looked up from his guitar case. "That's nice, Mom, but we're good." The dismissal stung worse than the betrayal itself. I wasn't just losing my home, I was losing him. But I wasn't ready to give up. I'd spent 30 years putting Steve first, and some stubborn part of me believed I could fix this. So I kept going, paying the electric bill, mowing the lawn, even cleaning the guest room where Sarah had started storing moving boxes. I told myself it was for Steve, but deep down, I was clinging to the hope that he'd see me again, the way he did when he was little, when I was his hero. The bank statement and Sarah's notes, still hidden in my dresser, burned in my mind, but I wasn't ready to face what they meant. Not yet. That changed when I met Ellen. She was a librarian at the public library, where I'd been escaping to research property laws. Ellen was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. I'd seen her before, always at the reference desk, but we'd never spoken until one afternoon when I was struggling with a legal database. My hands were shaking, and I must have looked as lost as I felt, because she leaned over and said, "Honey, you look like you're carrying the world. Want some help?" Her voice was warm like a quilt on a winter night, and before I knew it, I was spilling pieces of my story. Not all of it, but enough. The house, Steve's deal, the way I felt like I was disappearing. Ellen listened, nodding, her glasses slipping down her nose. When I finished, she didn't offer pity. Instead, she handed me a book on Indiana real estate law and said, "You're stronger than you think, Linda. I've seen women like you, mothers, who give everything, come out on top, but you've got to fight for yourself now." She told me her own story quietly as we sat in a corner of the library. Her daughter had tried to push her into a nursing home a few years back, thinking Ellen was too old to live alone. Ellen had fought back, hired a lawyer, and kept her home. "They underestimate us," she said, her voice steady. "But we've got more in us than they'll ever know." Her words lit a spark in me, a reminder of the woman I'd been before I became just Steve's mom. Ellen became my lifeline. She helped me navigate legal websites, pointed me to free resources, and even gave me the name of a lawyer, Tom Bradley, who took pro bono cases for seniors. I met Tom at a coffee shop the next week, a small place that smelled of cinnamon and burnt espresso. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a handshake that meant business. I showed him the deed to the house and the real estate listing Steve had given me. "They can't sell it without your signature," he confirmed, flipping through the papers. "But they're banking on you not knowing that. Have they asked you to sign anything yet?" I shook my head, my stomach twisting. "Not yet," I said, "but they're acting like it's already done." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Sounds like they're hiding something." "Dig deeper, Linda. Check their paperwork, their accounts. People don't move this fast unless they're scared of being caught." Tom's advice echoed in my head as I drove home, the Indiana fields blurring past in shades of green and gold. I thought about the bank statement, the consulting fees, and Sarah's note about keeping me in the dark. What were they hiding that night while Steve and Sarah were at a band rehearsal? I went back to Steve's room. I felt like a thief, my heart pounding as I sifted through his desk. Under a pile of lyric sheets, I found something that stopped me cold, a letter from the music label addressed to Steve and Sarah. It wasn't a contract, but a preliminary agreement outlining the $500,000 advance. The fine print was what hit me hardest. The deal required a $450,000 good faith payment to secure the advance due in 30 days. The house sale, I realized, wasn't just collateral. It was their only way to cover that payment. But there was more. A handwritten note in the margin in Steve's messy scrawl read, "Sarah says the trust fund will cover the rest." Trust fund. What trust fund? I'd never set up anything like that, and Mark had died with nothing but debts. My hands shook as I read the letter again, the words blurring through tears. Steve and Sarah weren't just selling my home. They were banking on money that didn't exist, or did it? I remembered something Mark's sister Carol had mentioned years ago before she passed. She'd said Mark had left a little something for Steve, but I'd assumed it was just a sentimental keepsake, maybe a watch or a letter. Had there been more? And had Steve and Sarah found out about it? I called Carol's old friend Nancy the next day. Nancy had been the executor of Carol's estate and knew the family's financial history. Over the phone, her voice crackly with age, she confirmed my worst fears. "Mark did leave a trust for Steve," she said. "It was small, about $100,000 set up by his grandfather. It was meant to mature when Steve turned 30. I thought you knew." My heart sank. I hadn't known. No one had told me. And now Steve and Sarah were planning to use it along with my house to fund their LA dream without a word to me. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Steve wasn't just taking my home. He was exploiting a legacy I'd never even known about, one his father had left for him. I sat in my car outside the house, the engine off, the summer heat pressing against the windows. I thought of all the times I'd driven Steve to lessons, cheered at his gigs, believed in him when no one else did. And now, he was treating me like an obstacle, a line item to be crossed out. Sarah's note flashed in my mind. "Don't tell Linda until it's done." They thought I was weak compliant, a mother who'd roll over for her son's sake. They were wrong. That night, I lay awake, the house creaking around me like it was morning too. I thought of Ellen's words, Tom's advice, and the trust fund I'd never known existed. I couldn't keep pretending everything would fix itself. I'd spent decades putting Steve first, but now it was time to put myself first. I got out of bed, pulled the deed and the bank statement from my dresser, and started making a list. First, I'd call Tom in the morning to secure the house legally. Then, I'd dig into the trust fund, how Steve had accessed it and why he'd kept it secret. And finally, I'd confront them not as a pleading mother, but as a woman who'd had enough. As dawn broke, painting the sky in streaks of pink, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, raw and sharp, but it was joined by a fire I hadn't felt since my days in Chicago, when I'd fought for every pitch, every promotion. Steve and Sarah thought they'd won. They thought they could erase me. But I was Linda Carter, and I wasn't done yet. I folded my list, tucked it into my pocket, and stepped into the kitchen where the smell of last night's coffee lingered. The game had changed, and I was ready to play. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, glinting off the coffee pot I'd used for years, the one Mark and I had bought when we first moved into this house. I stood there clutching the list I'd made the night before, my resolve hardening with every sip of black coffee. Steve and Sarah thought they could sell my home, use a secret trust fund, and cast me aside like an old piece of furniture. They were wrong. Today, I wasn't just a mother who'd sacrificed everything. I was Linda Carter, and I was taking back my life. I called Tom Bradley, the lawyer Ellen had introduced me to, as soon as his office opened. My voice was steady, though my hands shook as I explained everything: the deed in my name, the bank statement, the labels agreement, and the trust fund I'd never known about. Tom listened, his pen scratching notes, and when I finished, he said, "Linda, you've got a strong case. They can't sell the house without your consent, and if they're hiding financial dealings, we can freeze their moves. But you need to act fast. Meet me at my office in an hour." I hung up, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment I stopped being a victim. Before leaving, I checked the safe in my bedroom. The $50,000 check was still there, alongside the deed and the documents I'd found in Steve's room. I tucked the deed and the bank statement into my purse, but left the check behind. It wasn't for them anymore. It was for me, a reminder that I'd built something even when I thought I had nothing. As I locked the safe, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. My eyes were tired, but there was a fire in them, the same fire I'd had in my 20s when I'd fought for every pitch in Chicago. I wasn't done yet. Tom's office was a small, cluttered space downtown, smelling of ink and old leather. He laid out the plan with the precision of a general. "First, we file an injunction to block any sale of the house," he said, sliding a form across his desk. "It'll stop the realtor and any buyers in their tracks. Second, we request an audit of that joint account Steve and Sarah opened. Those consulting fees sound like a cover for something, maybe even fraud. And finally, we look into the trust fund. If Steve accessed it without your knowledge, there could be legal recourse." I nodded, signing the injunction papers, my signature bold and unbroken. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control. Filing the injunction was only the first step. Tom suggested I take a bolder move to protect my home and send a message. "You own the house outright," he said. "You can list it yourself under your terms, or even pull it off the market entirely. Show them you're not backing down." The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. Steve and Sarah thought they could bully me into signing away my home, but I could turn their game against them. I called their realtor, a slick man named Greg, who'd been dodging my questions, and told him the sale was off unless I approved it. "I'm the owner," I said, my voice firm. "No signature, no deal." He stammered, clearly caught off guard, and promised to call me back. I hung up, my pulse racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration. That afternoon, I took it further. I drove to a local print shop and had a sign made, "Property not for sale. Owner occupied." The words were in bold red letters, impossible to miss. Back home, I hammered the sign into the front yard myself, the thud of the mallet echoing in the quiet street. Neighbors peeked out curious, but I didn't care. This was my home, my stand. As I stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow, I felt a weight lift. For years, I'd poured my strength into Steve, but now I was using it for myself. It wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming my worth. When Steve and Sarah came home that evening, the sign was the first thing they saw. Sarah's face twisted, her clipboard clattering to the porch. "What is this, Linda?" She snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Steve stood behind her, his jaw tight, his eyes finally meeting mine. I crossed my arms, standing tall in the doorway. "This is my house," I said, each word deliberate. "You don't get to sell it, not without me." Sarah's mouth opened, then closed like a fish gasping for air. Steve took a step forward, his voice low. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The label's counting on us." I didn't flinch. "Then you should have talked to me, Steve, not plotted behind my back." The argument spilled into the living room, the air thick with tension. Sarah threw out excuses, the label's deadline, the $450,000 payment, their big break. Steve was quieter, his excuses weaker, but he didn't back down. "We didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice almost pleading. "We just need this." I looked at him, searching for the boy I'd raised, but all I saw was a man who'd chosen money over me. "You didn't want to hurt me?" I said, my voice rising. "You were going to leave me homeless, Steve. You and Sarah with your secret accounts and your trust fund I never knew about." Their faces froze, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. They hadn't expected me to know about the trust fund. Sarah recovered first, her eyes narrowing. "You've been snooping," she said, her tone accusing. I didn't deny it. "I had to," I said. "You left me no choice." Steve's hands clenched, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but he just turned away, muttering something about needing air. Sarah stormed after him, leaving me alone in the living room, the silence deafening. I sank onto the couch, my heart pounding, but I wasn't afraid. I felt alive, like I'd just run a marathon and crossed the finish line. I'd stood up to them, not with tears or pleas, but with action. The injunction was filed, the sign was up, and they knew I wasn't invisible anymore. As I sat there, the weight of what I'd done settled over me. It wasn't just about stopping the sale. It was about breaking free from the role I'd played for decades, the selfless mother who gave everything and asked for nothing. I'd loved Steve fiercely, but that love had blinded me to his flaws, to the way he'd let Sarah manipulate him. I wasn't sure what would happen next, whether they'd fight back, beg, or walk away, but I knew one thing. I was done letting them control me. The house was mine, and so was my future. Outside, the Indiana dusk settled the sky, a deep purple streaked with gold. I walked to the front door and looked at the sign, its red letters glowing faintly in the fading light. It was more than a declaration. It was a promise to myself. I'd built this life once, and I could rebuild it again on my terms. Steve and Sarah could scramble, but I was no longer their pawn. I closed the door, the click of the lock, a small, defiant sound, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The morning after I planted the not for sale sign in my front yard, the house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I stood at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee that had gone cold, the memory of last night's confrontation replaying in my mind. Steve's clenched fists, Sarah's accusing glare, the way the door slammed as they stormed out. I'd drawn a line, and there was no going back. My heart ached for the boy I'd raised, but the woman I was becoming, the one who'd filed an injunction and stood her ground, knew this was about more than saving a house. It was about saving myself. Steve and Sarah didn't return until late that day, their faces a mix of defiance and desperation. Sarah marched in first, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, a new stack of papers in her hand. "Linda, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight, like a coiled spring. Steve trailed behind, his eyes darting to the floor, avoiding the sign still standing proudly outside. I sat at the dining table, my hands folded, the deed to the house tucked safely in a folder beside me. "Go ahead," I said, my tone calm but unyielding. "Talk." Sarah launched into a rehearsed speech, her words sharp and calculated. The label's deadline is in 2 weeks. If we don't secure the $450,000, the deal's off. You're kind of screwing us over here, Linda. She slid a document across the table, a new contract, this one offering me a relocation stipend of $10,000 if I signed over the house. $10,000 for my home, my memories, my life. I almost laughed. Steve finally spoke, his voice softer, almost pleading. Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. We just need this break. Can't you see that I looked at him searching for a trace of the son who'd once drawn me pictures of guitars? But all I saw was a man caught in Sarah's web, chasing a dream that wasn't his anymore. I see plenty, I said, pushing the contract back. I see you trying to sell my home without my consent. I see secret bank accounts and a trust fund you never told me about. I see you choosing money over me. Steve flinched, but Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're being selfish, she snapped. This is Steve's future. I stood my chair, scraping the floor. And what about mine? I asked, my voice rising. I gave up everything for him, my career, my savings, my dreams. And you think I'm selfish for keeping the one thing I have left? The room went silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy. Sarah grabbed the contract and stormed out, muttering about fixing this. Steve hesitated, then followed, leaving me alone with the echo of my own voice. Their reaction wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Over the next few days, they tried to fight back. Sarah called the realtor Greg, demanding he move forward with the sale, but Tom's injunction had already reached his office. Greg left me a voicemail, his tone nervous. Mrs. Carter, the sale's on hold until the court resolves this. I'm sorry, I didn't know the property wasn't cleared. I didn't call him back. Sarah also started spreading rumors, telling Steve's bandmates and mutual friends that I was holding Steve back from his big break. I overheard one of his friends, a drummer named Kyle, on the phone with Steve. Man, your mom's making it tough. Maybe talk to her. It hurt knowing people I'd once hosted for barbecues were buying Sarah's story, but I refused to let it shake me. Meanwhile, I worked with Tom to strengthen my position. He filed a motion to audit Steve and Sarah's joint account, suspecting the consulting fees might be tied to questionable dealings. If they're laundering money or hiding assets, Tom said, we'll find out. He also contacted the bank managing the trust fund, requesting a full accounting of its access history. The process was slow, but every step felt like reclaiming a piece of my power. I also met with Ellen at the library, where she introduced me to a group of women, her book club she called them, though it was more like a support network for women who'd faced betrayal. There was Maria, a 62-year-old widow, whose son had drained her savings, and Janet, a 55-year-old divorcee who'd fought her ex for their family home. They listened to my story, their nods and quiet encouragements like a balm to my wounds. You're not alone, Maria said, squeezing my hand. And you're tougher than they think. Their support gave me the courage to take another step. I decided to go public, not with rumors, but with the truth. I wrote a letter to Steve's bandmates and our close friends, explaining why I'd stopped the house sale. I didn't name the trust fund or the bank account, keeping those for the legal battle, but I laid out the basics. Steve and Sarah had planned to sell my home without my consent, leaving me with nowhere to go. I emailed it from the library, my fingers trembling as I hit send. Within hours, Kyle the drummer called me. Mrs. Carter, I had no idea, he said, his voice heavy. Steve made it sound like you were okay with it. I'm sorry. Others reached out too, some apologizing, others offering help. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. I was no longer the villain in their story. The most unexpected connection came from Nancy, the executor of Carol's estate, who'd told me about the trust fund. She invited me to her home, a cozy bungalow filled with photos of her grandkids. Over tea, she shared more details about the trust. Mark set it up through his grandfather's estate, she said, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. It was meant for Steve's future college, a house, something solid. I'm sorry you didn't know. She paused, then pulled out a faded envelope. Carol left this for you in case you ever needed it. I forgot until now." Inside was a letter from Carol written before her death and a small key. The letter was short but piercing. "Linda, you're the heart of this family. If Steve ever forgets that, remind him. The keys for the safe deposit box at First National. It's yours." My throat tightened. Carol had known even then that I might need a way out. I went to the bank the next day, the key heavy in my pocket. The safe deposit box held more than I'd expected: $20,000 in cash, a few family heirlooms, and a note from Mark written before he died. "Linda, you're my strength. Take care of Steve, but don't forget yourself." I sat in the bank's quiet room, tears streaming down my face. Mark had seen me even when I couldn't see myself. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to start over, to hire Tom for the long haul, or to invest in something new. I tucked the note into my purse, a talisman against the pain. Back home, I faced Steve one last time before the court date. He came alone without Sarah, his face pale and tired. "Mom," he said, standing in the living room, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Can we work this out?" His voice cracked, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd loved, but I'd learned too much. "You made your choice, Steve," I said, my voice steady. "You chose the money, the deal, Sarah. Now you face the consequences." He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. It hurt, but it also freed me. I wasn't fighting for his love anymore. I was fighting for me. As the week ended, I stood in my backyard, the rose bushes glowing in the Indiana twilight. The injunction was in place, the audit was underway, and I had allies: Ellen, Tom, Maria, Janet, even Nancy. I'd found money I didn't know I had, and a note from Mark that reminded me who I was. Steve and Sarah were still out there plotting their next move, but I was ready. I'd face their betrayal and come out stronger. The house was still mine, and so was my future. For the first time, I believed I could build something new, not for Steve, but for Linda Carter. The Indiana autumn arrived quietly. The maple trees outside my house turning a fiery red, their leaves drifting onto the lawn I'd fought so hard to keep. I stood on the porch, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands, the not for sale sign still standing like a sentinel in the yard. It had been weeks since the confrontation with Steve and Sarah, weeks since I'd found Mark's note in the safe deposit box, weeks since I'd realized I didn't need their approval to know my worth. The house was still mine, the injunction holding firm, and the audit of Steve and Sarah's account was inching forward, uncovering transactions Tom called highly irregular. But the victory wasn't in the legal battles or the sign. It was in the woman I'd become, one who'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger, not broken. I'd spent years defining myself through Steve, his dreams, his music, his future. Every sacrifice, from quitting my job to draining my savings, had been for him. But now, standing in the crisp morning air, I saw clearly I wasn't just his mother. I was Linda Carter, a woman who'd built a career in Chicago, raised a son alone, and now at 57 was rebuilding her life on her own terms. That realization was like sunlight breaking through a storm. It didn't erase the pain of Steve's betrayal, but it gave me permission to let go of the need for his love to define me. I was enough. With the house secure, I turned my energy to creating something new. The $20,000 from the safe deposit box, combined with the $50,000 I'd originally saved for Steve, gave me a foundation. I met with Ellen's book club again, and Maria, the widow whose son had taken her savings, suggested I start a small business. "You're a PR genius," she said, her eyes bright. "Why not consult for local businesses? They need someone like you." The idea sparked something in me, a flicker of the ambition I'd buried decades ago. I spent evenings at the library drafting a business plan, designing a website, and reaching out to small businesses in Indianapolis. My first client was a family-owned bakery, struggling to compete with chain stores. I crafted a marketing campaign that boosted their sales by 30% in a month. The work was hard, but it felt like coming home. I also found a new kind of family, not bound by blood, but by shared strength. Ellen invited me to join the book club officially, and those women, Maria Janae and others, became my anchors. We met weekly discussing books, but also life-sharing stories of loss and triumph. Janet, who'd fought her ex for her home, taught me how to negotiate with confidence. Maria shared recipes, her laughter filling the gaps left by Steve's absence. Through them, I learned that family isn't just who you're born with. It's who shows up when you need them most. Even Kyle, Steve's drummer friend, stayed in touch, stopping by to mow the lawn or bring me coffee. His quiet apologies, a reminder that not everyone had turned away. The legal battle with Steve and Sarah wound down, though not without drama. The audit revealed they'd been funneling money from the trust fund into their joint account, mislabeling it as consulting fees to dodge taxes. Tom filed a claim on my behalf, arguing that as Steve's guardian during his childhood, I should have been informed of the trust. The court agreed, freezing the remaining $80,000 until a full investigation was complete. Steve and Sarah missed the label's deadline, and the $500,000 deal collapsed. I heard through Kyle that they'd moved to a cramped apartment in LA anyway, scraping by on gig money. Part of me ached for Steve, but I couldn't carry his choices anymore. He'd made his bed, and I had to let him lie in it. One evening, as I sat in my living room, the walls glowing with the soft light of a lamp I'd bought myself, I wrote a letter to Steve. Not to send, but to release. I loved you with everything I had, I wrote, but I can't be your safety net anymore. I hope you find your way, but I've found mine. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer next to Mark's note. It was a small act, but it felt like closing a chapter. I didn't need Steve to read it to know I'd moved on. As winter approached, I hosted a small gathering at the house, not a grand party like Steve's birthday, but a quiet evening with Ellen, Maria, Janet, Kyle, and Nancy. We ate pot roast and cherry cobbler, laughed over stories, and toasted to new beginnings. The house, once a battleground, felt like a home, again filled with warmth and voices that valued me. Standing in the backyard later, the stars sharp against the Indiana sky, I thought of Mark's words. Don't forget yourself. I hadn't forgotten. I'd remembered, and I'd built something better. My message to anyone listening is this: you are never too old to start over. Betrayal hurts, whether it's from a child, a spouse, or a friend, but it doesn't define you. You do. Find your strength, lean on those who lift you up, and don't be afraid to fight for what's yours. I was a mother who gave everything, but I'm also a woman who took it back. And if I can do it, so can you. The road isn't easy, but it's yours to walk, and every step is worth it. I turned back to the house, the porch light casting a golden glow. The rose bushes were bare now, but I knew they'd bloom again in spring. So would I. I stepped inside the door, closing softly behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. This was my home, my life, my story, and I was writing the next chapter. As I sit here tonight, the Indiana stars twinkling above my porch, I'm filled with a quiet strength I never knew I had. My journey from the sting of Steve's betrayal to the triumph of reclaiming my home and my worth taught me that no one can take your value unless you let them. But I know I'm not alone. So many of you have faced your own battles, whether it's a family member's betrayal, a dream deferred, or a fight for what's yours. Your stories matter, and they deserve to be heard. I want to hear from you. In the comments below, share how you've overcome heartbreak or stood up for yourself. What did you learn? Who lifted you up? Your voice is powerful, and together we can inspire others to find their strength. Let's build a community where no one feels invisible. You're not just a viewer, you're part of this story. So take a moment, share your truth, and let's show the world that it's never too late to rewrite your ending.
Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, because this story is about to take you on an emotional journey you won't soon forget.